We're going up and down, over and over. It's the same old thing. Up and down, over and under.
All right. Well, Chris, I am pumped to have you on. Thank you for joining the show.
Thank you. I'm very excited as well. This is great.
Yep. So I meant to tell you before we started, but when I was preparing for this, my daughter was watching, I think, Scooby-Doo in the background. And she was like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "Well, I'm having a scientist on the podcast." And her eyes just lit up. Like in her world right now, what she wants to be is, and probably in this order, acrobat, scientist, dancer, singer. So scientist is right up there. So I've been trying to keep her interested in like what I do for years to no avail. But when she heard I'm having a scientist, like she's never been more interested. So
That's awesome.
You've made her week.
That's awesome. Well, I try and do a fair bit of outreach to middle school students, elementary school students, sometimes a lot of high school students, and try and get them interested to come at the lab and see what we do and get excited about science, because we need more good scientists. We need more people really believing in science and wanting to see good science. And it's an awesome gig. I mean, if people want to go into a field where you always have a job and always have things to keep you interested, science is a good place to go.
Yeah, well, and I've loved looking at what I have access to see, the lab that you've built up at the University of Oregon, and I want to make sure we get to talk about this environmental chamber that I keep seeing YouTube videos of, because that just looks awesome.
And I'll tell you, we're for those of you who don't know, I'm at the University of Oregon, and Eugene, Oregon is really known as Track Town, USA. So there's a lot of interest in track and field here, and in 2021, theoretically, there's supposed to be the World Track and Field Championships here. And so it's the first time in American soil, which is shocking considering the dominance of the U.S. in track and field. And that will be here in Eugene. And so as part of that, they built a brand new stadium. The world famous historic Hayward Field has been kind of destroyed, and a whole new stadium has been put in. So if you go online and look at University of Oregon and look at Hayward Field, you'll see a whole different look, and it's going to be a world-class facility. Some sadness for all of us to see the original historic where Prefontaine ran and all these famous events happened. But my new lab will actually be in part of that building. So I'll be in kind of one of the corners there with two of my colleagues. So it's going to be pretty cool.
Oh, very cool. I actually went to Hayward Field. I guess I was a senior in high school. I played football in college, and the Nike Combine, at least regionally, was at the University of Oregon. But I remember, while we were outside Autzen Stadium, my dad and I made sure we got there a day early so we could walk the campus and specifically go check out Hayward Field. So I'm glad I got the opportunity to do that, even though I guess it was, 10, 12 years ago. But that's amazing. And as if the University of Oregon needed better facilities, now the track team is going to have a world-class facility.
Yeah, exactly.
That's exciting. Well, very cool. Well, I think a great place to start, because you do so much interesting work. And like I said before we started, a million things I want to ask you. Could you give people a little bit of context as to what it is you're currently doing at the University of Oregon in terms of your research?
Sure. I'm an integrative cardiovascular physiologist. And what that means is my focus is cardiovascular physiology, but I look at it at a very integrative perspective. I want to look at how the different organ systems all interact, but primarily around cardiovascular. I'm also an environmental physiologist. So my true love and passion is really how the environment, either acute exposures or with chronic exposure, impacts human health as well as human performance. So it's really that blending of cardiovascular and other aspects of physiology with environmental challenges in the context of both health and performance that just totally get me up and going every morning.
Yeah. And when you say performance, are we talking about like high level elite athlete performance, or does it truly run the gamut in terms of like kind of what that definition can mean in terms of like what you're researching?
Sure. It can mean the whole gamut. Absolutely. And one thing that's really, really tough is doing very, very good, well-controlled studies in the elite athletes. So a lot of work I do is actually working with athletes on individual basis to make them better, to make them perform better. But that oftentimes doesn't translate into an actual research study because we have an N of 4, and right? How do you keep one control group and not a control group? So a lot of that work we kind of keep in house and other things, but then I put it out there with my presentations and other things that I do as far as what we're doing with the elites. What we do get a lot more is kind of that sub elite level. So if I'm a struggling cyclist or former cyclist or something like that. And so those of you who know cycling kind of know the category 1, 2, 3 for cycling and 4 and 5. So we're looking really at people like who are, that Cat 2. So not quite national team, but they're very, very good, competent cyclists. And the same thing with the runners, people who can pretty much go anywhere in the country and win 10Ks and other things, but they're also not competing at the elite level. So we get a lot of that kind of research coming through.
So a lot of folks who, like you said, are at a very high level, but are they trying to eke out any performance gains to take them to the next level? Is that kind of the intent there?
Sometimes, yeah. I'd say that's definitely part of it. And again, with Eugene being unique in the Tracktown USA, we get a lot of runners who are here for that purpose, to immerse themselves in the running culture and the fastest people. I think Boulder, Colorado is another place like that. And so you get a lot of these just under that elite level to try to crack into that. But there's also a lot of just age groupers who want to get a little bit faster as well. And then, of course, we dovetail that with the ill, the sick, right? We have a couple clinical trials looking at people who are obese, people with hypertension, people taking medications. We also look at that to see how these environmental stressors can improve their cardiovascular and metabolic health.
Yeah. So with that, and you mentioned Colorado, which for me immediately, I think, mile high, thinner air, like that's why a lot of these athletes go train. And I think the Olympic training facility, right, is in Colorado.
Yeah, Colorado Springs.
Colorado Springs, right.
They also have one in San Diego as well.
Oh, okay. Awesome. Well, boy, I would like to get signed up for that one. So with that in mind, when you start looking at opportunities to help athletes improve their performance, and perhaps they go hand in hand, like to what extent is the biggest opportunity looking at things from purely a cardiovascular level versus looking at things from like an environmental level? Because I know you specialize in understanding like how the body reacts to heat, performs in heat, correct? Is that an accurate description?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I've done, as a true integrative physiologist and environmental physiologist, I look at different environments as well. I've done work in hypoxia and, high altitude, done stuff in cold as well. But certainly heat has been kind of where I've kind of carved out a niche for myself. And that's where a lot of people come to me for. A lot of cases, it started off, I should say, if you want to go the whole history, I can tell you how I got it.
Please. I would love it.
Okay. All right. Sure.
Absolutely.
Well, how far back to go, I guess. Really, I did my undergrad at University of Arizona, and I was a bike racer there, cyclist. And I went to California to try and make the pro ranks and all that kind of stuff. And then ran into a little problem where I wasn't fast enough. And I guess you want to be a pro, you got to be really, really fast. No one told me that. So I was kind of looking for something to do in San Diego. I was coaching swimming and doing triathlons and kind of mucking about. Started at San Diego State, working there as a grad student doing my master's. And I was looking for a job as well. And because being a non-professional cyclist does not pay very well.
Yeah.
And so I saw a flyer to go work for the Naval Health Research Center there in San Diego. And this is right around the time of the first Gulf War. And so I talked to my professors who I saw their name on the flyer, and they said, oh, yeah, contact this person, call. And so I ended up getting hooked up with the Naval Health Research Center there, and we were doing heat strain countermeasures. So the United States was prepared at that point to go and fight the Cold War. And the next thing you know, we're heading off to this hot desert. And so there were a lot of problems. And the concern at the time was that Saddam Hussein had biochemical warfare. So they're having to wear these mop warfare gear, which is basically like wearing plastic bags to keep chemicals out, right?
In the desert,
in the desert.
Plus heat. Oh, wow.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we're looking at ways to keep these people, specifically the Marines, these men and women alive without overheating. So, and I was just basically cleaning rectal probes and doing that kind of stuff. So I wasn't not very glorious. But at some point, some of my military people in the military there, as well as my professor, said, you kind of seem to like this research thing. You should think about it. And that was the first time I started thinking, wow, research. Ended up going to Penn State, worked with a guy who's like one of the world's experts on aging and temperature regulation, Larry Kenny. And really from that, during that time, I was also, my master's thesis was looking at some elite performance. And so I kind of started blending the things between I really love. I like working with patient populations, seeing real improvements in health. I definitely like environmental physiology. As I mentioned, cardiovascular is kind of my main area because I was always intrigued by the heart and the blood vessels. And so it's really been a blending from all those things. But what really got me going, I guess, with working at the elite level performance and really having the opportunity was we were helping, is right before the Beijing Olympics. And we thought that the Beijing Marathon could potentially be really, really hot, the hottest on record. It's possible. It's possible Japan in 2021 could actually be hotter. But it was, so Beijing was going to be very, very hot. And so
Well,
I was
and
working.
the air quality there too was a huge concern at the time. I remember as well, right?
Absolutely, absolutely, yep, yep.
Yeah.
And I was interviewed a couple times about the air quality stuff, and that's certainly not my area of interest or area of expertise, I have to say. Certainly interest.
Yeah.
And there wasn't much they could do about that. You can't really prepare for bad air, right? You can try and
Right.
filter it out or other things, but how do you train for it? It's a little harder.
Yeah.
So training for the heat was a little different. So I was
Yeah.
working with one of the top U.S. marathoners at the time, a guy named Dathan Ritzenheim.
Hmm.
And his coach approached us and said, look, we know it's going to be hot. What are we going to do? And I said, well, the best thing we can do is heat acclimate. And in starting working with Dathan, I realized a couple of things. One is that when you're working with that level athlete, especially one who does a long endurance athlete, right? They're just putting massive miles into their body, into their legs, and it's pounding. And so you can't say, well, just go do a whole bunch more work. You'll be fine. You'll get ready for the heat. These are really finely tuned machines, right? These humans, they're like working with thoroughbreds, really twitchy. You don't want it easy to overtrain, don't want to disrupt things. So we really put a lot of thought into, okay, how can we get Dathan ready to perform at his best in the heat and yet not detract his performance at all? And my concern at the time was, well, if we look at the physiology and kind of think through it, there are some reasons to think that if we got him ready for his highest performance in a hot condition, is it possible we could deter we could like have him have not as good a performance if it wasn't as hot? Because you can't predict the weather on a given day, right? We kind of thought it'd be hot, but you never know for sure. And so luckily, we started finding out that through some other little side projects at the time to make sure we're doing what we're doing. I didn't see any way that if we did this heat stress right, heat acclimation right, that we would deter his performance if it was a bit less hot. On the day of the marathon, the cameras were all on a guy named Ryan Hall because he was the U.S.'s top runner. It ended not being quite as hot as we kind of thought it might be. I think it would be hotter. Dathan might have done even better, but he ended up being the top American. I think he placed 8th overall. Had a great marathon. And despite it being so hot, he actually performed really well. Like I said, Ryan Hall, I think, was not as prepared for the heat and really faded. And so that was really, really interesting and kind of eye-opening for us too, to work with that level athlete and to make sure that what we're doing is, it's very easy to get heat acclimated. Humans have amazing ability to adapt to the heat. It shaped our evolution. It shaped all kinds of stuff. So, it's amazing how high temperatures we can perform as long as we have adequate water to bring in to stay hydrated so we can sweat. Then we can keep performing really, really well. But it's different when you look at an elite athlete and not want to deter their performance. So we followed that up with a kind of extensive study in cyclists. Sometimes I do cyclists because it's my own personal interest, but also it's easy to quantify the work, right? We can look at actual watts and actual workloads and those kind of things. And it's also easier to study someone who's not on the treadmill bouncing all over the place, right? As opposed to being in a more stable position.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so we recruited a bunch of these sub-elite Cat 2, Cat 1, a couple Cat 1s and a Cat 3 cyclists, and we did a pretty extensive project where we looked at all kinds of cardiovascular measures. We wanted to compare them after a 14-day heat acclimation period, what their performance was before and after in both hot and cool conditions. And what we found is that by doing it the way we did it, we can actually improve someone's. We knew they get better in the heat, so they perform much better in the heat after the heat acclimation period.
Right.
But they also perform better in the cool condition after the heat acclimation period. And that was a little bit surprising. And so we thought, if nothing else, might be, level out the same. But in some cases, is it possible they could actually have improvement, or would we make it worse? And like we saw with Dathan, and we saw that we actually saw a little better improvement, I think, with the heat acclimation. And that kind of, we published that paper, and it's gotten a lot of attention, both in the lay press and also in the physiological journals. Yeah. And some people have confirmed it. Some people have said it's not exactly, it doesn't help in the cool. So there's a lot of controversy right now. It's quite exciting to look at the area because, science is never perfect, and you tweak a couple of variables here, tweak a couple of variables there, things might change. But I and others have also used this extensively with elite level athletes, as well as a lot of the sub-elites. And one of the take-home messages I always have for people is if you think there's a chance that's going to be hot where you're going to be performing, you're going to be exercising, you're better off getting heat acclimation. If you do it right, we can talk about that in a moment. If we do that right, then there's almost no downside to it, to getting heat acclimated. And in certain individuals, I'd say there's definitely some level of improvement performance. And this could be only a 2 or 3, 4% improvement in performance, but that's the difference between being a gold medalist and being 10th in the pack, right?
Right.
At that level. So it's pretty exciting. It's pretty interesting. And like I said, it has to be done the right way. And that's where people kind of go, for lack of a better term, pear-shaped, I guess, is they kind of don't do it the right way and overcook themselves. But it's
literally.
Yeah, literally. Yeah, exactly. Literally. Yeah. Overcook themselves as far as temperature as well as just way too much fatigue in their body.
Yeah. So I have a couple questions there. How much work is actually required, or maybe it's time spent in a different, environment to actually become acclimated? Like you said, this initial test was over 14 days.
Right. Yeah. We've used 10 and 14-day protocols for heat acclimation. That was actually, I think, 10. I think I misspoke. I think it was actually 10-day heat acclimation protocol we did. Yeah. Yeah. What happens is, so each environment is different. And so, if you go to high altitude, for instance, you have certain adaptations in a couple days, a couple adaptations about 4 or 5 days after that, but you're not really fully acclimated until you can start making new red blood cells. That's why that, live high, train low idea comes from. So you need to be, 14 to 21 days before you really start getting fully adapted to that environment.
And that's why folks hang out at base camp for, like you said, like weeks, month, right?
Right.
Before they try and ascend Everest.
Right. Yeah. Yep. And being up that high is actually detrimental to aerobic performance, which we can talk about in a second here. But with the heat, though, it's a little different. I mean, if we put someone in a heat chamber and look at their core, their how high their core temperature gets, or how high their heart rate gets at a given workload under a certain higher environmental temperature. Every day we do that, they're improving. So by day 3, day 4, day 5, they're tolerating the heat stress much, much better. We typically say, for a performance perspective, we want people to get about 10 to 14 days of heat exposure to really kind of be making sure for that environment that they're adapted well for that.
And what sort of like physiological adaptations are actually taking place that makes it, I don't know if the right word is easier, but it enables an athlete to actually start to perform better in hotter environments?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's, I'll try and keep it fairly straightforward because it really gets, it can get complex very quickly.
Okay. Yeah. Dumb it down for me.
I'm not dumbing it down. Trust me. I always tell everyone, I surround myself by people much smarter than me, purposely, because I have so many bright grad students and coordinators and everybody else who work around me. So I learn more from them than they do from me, I think. So I'm very good about dumbing it down because it bring it down to my level.
Perfect. We're gonna get along famously then.
Perfect. Yeah. So I'd say really one of the first things that happens is that we have an increase in plasma volume, and that's the amount of water that's in our blood. So we get an expansion of our plasma volume, of our blood volume, within just a couple days, and that's one of the real physiological changes that underpin better adaptation to the heat. That's one of the things that happens really early on. The second thing is our perception of the heat also goes way down. So our heart rate, for instance, and our thermal comfort, each successive day with heat acclimation, we start seeing declines in these. So if, let's say you're doing a run in a relatively cool environment, and your heart rate at a given speed and grade is about 140, right? We put you in the heat, now you're at 160, 165. That same speed, same grade, same everything, just now the heat, right? So then successive days, by day 3, 5, 7, 10, 14, we're going to start seeing that heart rate of 160 start going back down to that 140 that you would be if it had been a colder temperature. And that's partly due to the plasma volume shift. Part of that's our sweating becomes more effective, for lack of a better term. It starts a little bit early. We can have a higher sweat rate for a given body temperature, and that can help us cool our bodies a little better. And if you're saying, well, now I'm sweating more, so you need to be taking more fluids, but you also have expanded plasma volume, so there's some benefits to that. And so those are kind of some of the real key things that kind of start early on that really make adaptation to the heat better.
And I imagine, like you said, for China, I imagine Rio was a similar story. When these high-level athletes come in and they're I don't even know if I'm using the right word here, preparing for like heat acclimation, like how much time per day do they need to spend actually getting acquired? Or is time not even like the right kind of like unit of measure in terms of like getting the body to adapt?
Time is a great measure, yeah, and I'd say time and perception. So a lot of athletes
Oh,
we work with don't have access to measuring their core temperature. Some people, of course, don't like to have rectal temperatures. We have ingestible pills that are very expensive. Other methods don't work well enough to really look at core temperature during exercise. And
wow.
so really, it's time and temperature that makes the biggest difference.
Hmm.
We aim for getting people's body temperature. I was thinking Celsius. I'll say about 38.5. Degrees Celsius, but we're talking about 100 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. We want to get people's body temperature up to. So if we
Huh.
can get them up to that temperature and hold them there for upwards of an hour on 10 days, so it could be 10 days over 15 days, for instance. It doesn't have to be every day. We know we can get them heat acclimated, and they'll be much better for that environment. It does get a little complicated when talking about the elites again.
Hmm.
I'll tell you one complication is, as you mentioned, Rio. Rio is not only hot and dry, or hot, and it's also very humid, right? So that makes
Yeah.
things a lot more difficult because now your sweating efficiency and ability to evaporate the sweat, which is what cools you off, has gone away. So,
Right.
but still, heat acclimation will still make a real big difference in that environment as well. So one of the things that when working with elites that is really, really, really key is that we can't take someone like a Dathan Ritzenheim or I know you've had a lot of elite athletes on here. We can't take one of them and say, oh, okay, now you got to spend the next 3 weeks, you got to put 10 to 12, 14 days of heat acclimation in there, because that's
Right.
going to fatigue them. They're going to, the first few days, especially doing heat acclimation, you're more tired, you feel dehydrated, you might throw your sleep off, all these kind of things. So we got to try and be really, really careful. So one thing we did in
Hmm.
that study in cyclists that I think was really important, and one thing that we did also with the elite athletes like Dathan Ritzenheim early on, was we looked at their training program. And we said, okay, what are days that we can trickle in some heat? And we definitely do not want them doing heat before any kind of really key workout. If they have a really high intensity interval day, or they have a really long run they have to do and have to perform at a certain tempo, we don't want to disrupt that. If we're adding heat on those days and making them run slower or anything else, they're not going to perform as well. So we
Hmm.
really have to try and dose the heat at the right time frame to improve their performance. So oftentimes, they could do a harder workout day and then come back, and later that afternoon they would add we'd add heat stress to them, and this could be even through hot tubs. I worked with a bunch
Hmm.
of national caliber steeplechasers, and we did the same thing. They were coming down from altitude, and we were trying to use heat acclimation to help improve and maintain their blood volume up high and get them heat acclimated. And so we had them do their really intense workouts. They finish and come in, they just kind of sit in their hot tub for 45 minutes afterwards to keep their
Oh,
body
wow.
temperature up.
How
Yeah,
long
so that
actually?
worked really well.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that actually, now I have two questions for you. I
Mhm.
guess one, like how long do those adaptations last? So like, you're kind of making me think about this in a different way, right? You don't want to take an elite athlete who's heading to the Olympics and then I guess have them spend like 10 days straight running in a really taxing environment. Cause to your point, right, it's more difficult. They're probably also trying to peak. So interested in understanding, how long do those adaptations last? But then I guess a follow-up question is also, because when you said hot tub, I hadn't considered that, right? I just thought like running in a hot environment. So does it matter like what type of environment you're actually being exposed to the heat?
Yeah, so let's take the second one first.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's a great question. The way you phrased it was great. So in general, it doesn't matter how you get the heat. We want to get the body temperature up. We want to get it high enough for the physiological adaptations. But
Hmm.
there's a cognitive side of it too, right? And so if you're taking an elite athlete and they're going to be running in Beijing, or they're running in a very cold environment, or they're going to be running at higher altitude, we want them to feel that, to know what that's like. And you can't simulate that by someone sitting in a hot tub quite as easily. So when we're talking about the elites, then definitely we want to try and simulate the environment they're going to perform in. Last year's NC2A championships, 2 years ago now, because they were canceled last year,
Yeah.
the year
Yeah.
before, were in Austin, Texas. And so we had a bunch of the U of O duck athletes who train here, and it's usually pretty cool still in May and June. And we wanted to get them in the chamber and our environmental chamber and heat it up and get them just so they felt like what it's like to run in 100-degree heat with about 50%, 60% relative humidity. And the first few days they hated it, right? Just absolutely hated it. But we're doing it carefully, so not disrupting their most important workouts. But then by day 4 or 5, 6, they're running great. And then by the time I went down there, the coaches came back to me later and said, I saw all these athletes complaining and feeling horrible and just walking out. They weren't even hot yet. This came out of the hotel room. They're like, oh my gosh, it's so hot. I'm not gonna be able to run in this. Where the athletes who worked with us were like, yeah, let's go. I'm used to this. I've been doing this for the past couple of weeks, right? Past 3 weeks or so.
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing. So, well, and I can relate too. I mean, I actually grew up north of Seattle, and just something as easy as going to the east side of the state for like our state track meet. Like all of us who are on the West Coast where it was pretty temperate, like when we got out there, we're like, oh my God. And that was dry heat. So a completely different animal than what we've been talking about with like Rio, or even I guess Austin might be a little bit more dry, but yeah, I can completely relate. Just like the mental toll that takes if you're not prepared. So that has to be just a huge advantage.
Absolutely it is. Yeah. And even if you go outside the physiological side of things, which I know there are some benefits to heat acclimation on that, is the psychological and cognitive load the person has. A lot of people they're concerned about the heat, start drinking a whole bunch of water. I got to make sure I'm really topped up with my water. And then they end up getting hyponatremia because they're flushing out so much of their electrolytes, right? And they get cramping and all kinds of stuff. So it's a delicate thing. So getting an athlete to really prepare for these environments, to be used to it is something that's really, really, really important. And you also asked how long the benefits go. One thing that's nice about heat is if I'm going to have an athlete prepare for a certain event, let's say the event's June 1st, I don't want them coming to me. It does happen sometimes, on May 20th saying, oh, we got this big event in 10 days. What are we going to do? I'm like, okay, well, we can do some things, but if you had come to me a month ago or 2 months ago, we would have started trickling this in, getting them used to it, really integrating it well with their event and their training. So the good thing is that once you go through heat acclimation, it's about a 1-to-2 ratio, and I'll try and explain this best I can. If you do about 10 days of good heat acclimation, then over the next 20 days, you'll start slowly, gradually losing some of that benefit, so that every 2 days you don't get another heat exposure, you lose about 1 day of that heat acclimation. Right. So, but the thing that's nice about that is that once you've got that heat acclimation in you, that 2 weeks, if you then trickle in 1 day or 2 days a week of another heat exposure, then you can extend that out. And no one really has any good data about how long you can extend out the benefits. We've kind of looked at what happens when you just stop completely, right? So 10-day heat acclimation period. Over the next 20 days, you'll kind of gradually lose that. But if you add in one or even sometimes just doing intense exercise in a little bit warmer environments, your body temperature gets up high enough, we'll see some preservation of that benefit for longer periods of time. So it's a fairly robust response, meaning that it doesn't just like disappear immediately,
Yeah, that's interesting. And it sounds very similar, and I guess it would make sense because they're all physiological adaptations. But thinking about like strength training, right? Like if you get to a point and you peak, you don't have to continue to train kind of like at that rigor every week moving forward. You can kind of like maintain a lot of that by tapping back into it. I don't know what it is, every week or two, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever it is. But that sounds really interesting. One thing that I definitely want to make sure, because we've talked about it a lot already. Can you explain what this environmental chamber is?
Sure.
For people who are trying to visualize this over the audio.
Yeah, sure. It's one of my favorite toys in my lab. The long story short, it's a 12-foot by 12-foot by 12-foot walk-in freezer. And honestly, that's exactly what it's made. The same material, that's what it looks like. The difference is that, we can control the temperature from that. So we can go really from well below freezing, so, down to almost 0 degrees Fahrenheit, all the way up to very, very hot, so about 140 degrees Fahrenheit. So you can really manipulate that temperature very, very closely. But we can also manipulate the humidity. So we can make it from a very dry Arizona day to a very, very hot day in the summer, Georgia, for instance, right? We can really have the whole range of humidity from about 10% humidity all the way up to about 95% humidity. What's unique about our chamber is that we can also, it's not true hypobaric, meaning we can't lower the air pressure like you do by going to altitude. What we do
okay.
is we replace some of the oxygen in the room with nitrogen. This is kind of those Colorado altitude tent systems, or people are trying to simulate high altitude in there by sleeping in a tent, are doing
Yeah.
the same thing. You're just increasing the nitrogen, which is for the most part an inert gas for us. That means your oxygen level, if it's normally at about 21%, we can knock it down to 10%. Now you're basically kind of like you're up at the top of Pikes Peak, right?
Oh, wow.
And you're up there. So we can then simulate. So we can really simulate using those different factors there. Simulate anywhere where humans live long term on the planet. And I mentioned we're going to be moving into this new facility, and we have another chamber we're going to have. So I'll have a second one. This one will actually be able to control the wind speed in one part of the chamber really well too. So now we can actually simulate air movement, which is always tough for us to do. Yeah, so we'll be able to have, because like cyclists in particular, you put someone working at say 350 watts with very little airflow, they're going to get really, really hot, more so in our chamber than they would outside. But now we can put a 20, 24 mile per hour headwind on them and get adequate cooling. So now we're really simulating the outside environment as far as air movement as well.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting.
It's fun.
Yeah, that's very cool. Now, does a researcher also have to be in that 12 by 12 by 12 box, or do you get to kind of witness all of this from the comfort of your temperature controlled AC lab?
Right. I am a big believer in that. If you're going to ask a subject to do something, you better have done it yourself, right? I can't force my trainees and my postdocs and others to like coordinators to go into the chamber and do things, unless you're collecting data, of course. But I want everyone to experience it. So I put myself through anything I've ever asked my subjects to do, I've done myself. I love the heat. I love getting in there. I love the cold. It's fun to get in there. I mean, I will say we've done some studies where, now that I'm the boss man, I guess I can be like, well, I got to go grade some papers, or I got to go do this. I got to go write a grant.
Right.
They're all looking at me like, yeah, it's really bloody cold in here and you want out. We get it. Yeah.
Oh, you guys are training for that meet in New Orleans? Yeah. I got some finals papers I got to attend to, but
yeah, I got that thing I got to take care of. Yeah.
Right.
I do. I love it. I mean, being a athletic minded person, I think is just really, and loving physiology. One thing that's really cool is that I get to test my own physiology whenever I want. Right. Sometimes
cool.
my motivation isn't there. Like, wow, I should really go and do this. And it's like, that sounds miserable. But then I turn around and do it though.
Yeah. Well, and that's actually a perfect segue, because, we've spent a lot of time talking about, how this is used to create positive adaptation for elite athletes. Are there also benefits to, and I guess it could be like acute heat exposure, prolonged heat exposure for, just like the average person?
Absolutely. Yep. So, one thing that happens is the more work you do and the harder you work, humans are only about 25% efficient. That means that any work you're doing, any metabolic rate you have, and of course, an elite athlete working at their high levels is going to have a much higher metabolic rate. Only 25% of that actually goes into the ability to do work. Other 75% is all generated as heat, byproduct of metabolism. So we have to dissipate that heat. So a very elite athlete is going to generate massive amounts of heat, right? And they have to dissipate that. So that's kind of where we've seen some real benefits. But anybody doing work is going to only have about 25% efficiency as far as metabolic rate to creating actual work. So they're going to generate a lot of heat as well. And so the athlete, just by working at really, really high intensities, they're going to get some pretty good degree of heat acclimation. Those of us, mere mortals, who work at lower levels are still generating a lot of heat, but we're not getting those normal high loads. So my point there being that we can really adapt a lot to the high heat, where maybe the elites, because they do so much high intensity work and such a high workload, they're getting body temperatures up pretty regularly. I mean, it's almost impossible to run at the intensities they are, not getting your body temperature over, up to 100 or so, or 101.
But the average person who sits in an air conditioned office all day and, might be a weekend warrior and either gets on the bike on the weekend or, runs 3 times a week, to your point, like there's a large delta that could be made up, in other words.
Absolutely. Perfectly said. Yeah. Much better said than I just rambled on there. But yeah, you're exactly right. That's exactly the point, right? I will say, one thing that becomes really interesting is when he published this paper, for instance, and I work with a lot of, like I said, sub-elite athletes. as
Hmm.
well. And one thing that comes up a lot is they'll come to me and they say, I want to get this extra boost in 2 or 3% of my performance, so I really want to do this heat acclimation. Can you help me do it? And I'll say, well, let's look at your training first. Right.
Yeah.
Let's look at your nutrition. Let's look at your sleep habits. Let's look at, are you really training to get this maximize benefits? So a lot of people end up focusing on things like heat acclimation or other things, which again, I think are critically important, especially if you're going to be in a hot environment. Then they become this much bigger players. But just to increase performance, there are so many aspects. And as an athlete yourself, you know this, right? If you can dial in for you the best training program, the best sprint working, the best strength program, the best recovery program, the best mobility stuff that you can do, and the best sleep patterns. Sleep is such a huge one, right? And getting a lot of attention, as it should right now with athletes. If you can dial all that stuff in, then start looking for the other things that might help you improve performance, like heat acclimation, or if you're going to be in a cold environment, cold. But I do think, though, that if there's a chance you're going to be in an extreme environment, high altitude, colder environment, hot environment, you better think about that as well, because that can disrupt everything and have go from, you could be really fit and trained, and if you don't get that right, you'll blow the whole thing.
Yeah, no, that certainly makes sense. And, there's been, and it's funny, we can talk about this a little bit. When I initially reached out, I saw that day an article, it was talking about the benefits of training in cold conditions, right? There's also been a lot of discussion, and maybe not even so much discussion, but increased awareness around things like saunas. And I feel like it's within the context of like longevity. Can you speak to how beneficial regular heat exposure is for someone in that regard versus a high level athletic performance, trying to think about like, hey, I'm interested in living longer. I want to feel healthier for longer. I've heard a lot about saunas. Like, is this something that's worth my time?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And, we were speaking a few minutes before we actually went on air. I think it was that time anyway.
Yeah, right.
And I have, a lot of my work is funded by National Institutes of Health, American Heart Association, and these are all in patient populations. And so very early on, I got interested in how exposure to an extreme environments, and particularly heat, is very, very similar to an exercise stress. When you exercise, every single cell of your body knows you're exercising to some extent. When you get heat stressed to the levels talking about, right, getting your body temperature up a couple of degrees, for instance, every single cell of your body knows that, and they're stressed. Your heart rate goes up, your redistribution of blood flow goes up, your respiratory rate goes up, blood flow changes throughout your body. All of these things happen just like during exercise. So I started really looking at, okay, so if we have some people who can't exercise, or maybe perhaps aren't willing to exercise, or there's other barriers to exercise.
Yeah.
Perfect example is we've done some work in people with spinal cord injury, paraplegics, for instance,
wow.
right? And they can exercise, train all they want, but they don't get quite the same benefits from a cardiovascular health standpoint as an able-bodied person does. Done some work with people with hypertension now. We think of, exercise, so your blood pressure drops. Well, the blood pressure drop with exercise training really is not that great. So looking at other modalities or things that can include with exercise that might lower blood pressure. So there's a really growing body of research. I'm happy to say that I'm a very big part of that. The literature there comes from my lab, but then a lot of other fantastic labs. Some out of Finland, of course, where sauna use is really, really big, and they've done the really long-term studies.
Right.
They're showing really clear health benefits, everything from reductions of blood pressure to improvements of blood flow, so reducing the risk of heart attacks and stroke. Metabolic health gets better. So we have a study where we looked at women with a disorder called polycystic ovary syndrome. And these women tend to be obese, not all of them are, but they have a very high sympathetic outflow. They've got usually some degree of hypertension, some degree of insulin resistance. And with just heat therapy alone, repetitive bouts of, like, this is actually over more time. So let's talk about at least 2 months at this point.
Okay.
We saw some real reductions in blood pressure. We saw great reductions in their sympathetic outflow, which is the flight or fight response. We don't want that really active at rest. We saw that decrease. Their ability to use insulin improved profoundly. They didn't lose any weight whatsoever. So this is not a weight loss thing. And so it's, but arterial stiffness. So as you age, your arteries get more stiff. We're seeing that is greatly diminished with repetitive bouts of heat stress. And this is sauna. This has been shown also in hot tubs. We've been focused primarily on hot tubs, but sauna use absolutely. So all of it's really, really, there are big time health benefits. I've convinced so many people to go. Unfortunately, I'm not in the business of selling hot tubs and saunas, but I should have gotten into it.
Not yet.
Because they're not yet. Yeah, exactly. Not yet. Yeah. The Oregon hot tub or something like that.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah. So, but their health benefits are profound and long lasting as well.
And what is that? And so you mentioned things like arterial stiffness and blood flow. What's actually happening when someone gets in the hot tub, not exercising, that is maybe creating the benefit?
Excellent question. Yeah, yeah. So it's like I was trying to say earlier, it's very much like exercise, right? Your heart has to beat faster, has to beat a little more forcefully to keep blood circulating around. That's just like exercise, and the heart is a muscle, so it can absolutely improve its ability to function. Your blood vessels, same thing. We know that without getting too technical into this, the way the blood goes through your vessels is really, really important to the health of those blood vessels. In general, you've seen probably pictures of blood flow where it kind of goes forward, backwards, forward, backwards, forward, backwards as the heart beats, right? It goes mostly forward, a little bit back, forward, a little bit back. That creates what we call a shear stress upon the blood vessels. And if you're always in that forward, backwards, forward, backwards, forward, backwards, it's not the healthiest thing for your blood vessels. So one thing that happens during exercise, you think about this, the blood vessels in your arm, by way of example, get healthier by doing leg exercise. How's that, right? Your arms aren't doing any work, but they're getting healthier. Part of it is because, and the same thing with the blood vessels of the heart, right? And blood vessels in your brain, other places. Why is that? So part of it is because as you exercise, or get heat stress, we found out, is that you're, rather than going from this forward, backwards, forward, backwards, forward, backwards blood flow pattern, you go into this more forward flow for a period of time, while you're exercising and for a period of time after you're done exercising. And that more forward flow changes how the blood vessels, the cells within the blood vessels respond. And you hear about this nitric oxide, right? This vasodilator that's so well known. It's the reason why everyone takes antioxidants, because antioxidants break down nitric oxide. It's why people take Viagra, because that helps prevent the breakdown of nitric oxide. So all these things that nitric oxide is really potent vasodilator. We know that the shear pattern of this blood flow through those cells in your blood vessels makes a real difference in the health of those blood vessels. They have these more nitric oxide production. They have decreases in things that cause it to vasoconstrict, and the blood vessels themselves change a little bit from these more stiff blood vessels to more flexible, distensible blood vessels. Other thing that's a little more complex is that we have these things called these proteins in our body called heat shock proteins. They've been in our body forever. These heat shock proteins were actually part of our cells when we were amoebas floating around in the ocean, right? So that millions and millions of years ago. So they're a fundamental part of who we are. And they're called heat shock proteins because they're first identified in response to heat, but they're actually really should be stress shock proteins. So hypoxia or cold stress, a bunch of things can actually stimulate these proteins, and they're really important. They're in every one of our cells of our body, and they regulate a lot of our function. So it's almost impossible to exercise without your body temperature going up. So we know that. So we believe that some of the real benefits to exercise are actually because your body temperature is going up and you're activating and upregulating these heat shock proteins. Now, these heat shock proteins do all kinds of things. They're so involved in that nitric oxide pathway I was mentioning about. They're actually also antioxidant, so they're going to help decrease the oxidative stress we get. They're anti-inflammatory. Low-grade inflammation is a real big problem right now, and one of the benefits of exercise that isn't too stressful is that we have this reductions in inflammation in our body during the resting periods. But they also help make our cells stronger. They help hold the shape of the cells. So one area that's really, I should finish that off by saying that what's really cool about these heat shock proteins is that they do all kinds of things. And we know they're upregulated with exercise. And we know they're upregulated with heat stress, for two examples. What's really cool about them is that, and this would be an impossible study to really try and do in humans, I think, but they do make our structure of our cells better. So you as a football players, for example, I was a ski racer a long time ago, and we used to ski race without helmets all the time because in the 70s we didn't wear helmets to ski race, right?
What do we need that for?
Yeah, exactly. No, so I know I've had at least 4 good ski concussions at least.
Right.
But one thing that's been some animal work very early on where they've looked at concussions in animals and shown that a heat acclimated animal actually has less problems or less results impacted from a head injury.
Oh,
So
wow.
so I think that, there's, and again, because these heat shock proteins are there making the cells of the brain stronger. They also help clean up dirty proteins. So when you have a big injury or something, that all that guck that comes out into cells from that byproduct of that injury has to get cleaned up. The heat shock proteins help upregulate that. So again, I'd love to find a way to do the study the right way, but there's evidence, at least from animal work, that even these heat shock proteins can be involved in recovery or prevention of the damage from things like concussions and even the recovery from it. So I think it's pretty cool.
One of the things, so am I understanding this correctly with the heat shock proteins? Is it that by working out, by heat exposure, and this I'm sure is a terrible oversimplification. Is it that our body actually creates more heat shock proteins, and they're the benefit is it by having more of them, they're able to help with all these other processes that are kind of just so vital to our everyday like healthy physiology?
Absolutely. Yep. It's exactly what it is. And
Okay.
the question becomes, well, how do they get upregulated? Well, we know that that in the heat, you can take, we've done this in our lab where we've taken isolated human cells and we grow them in a media, and then we actually can heat them up, right, for up to physiological levels. And we'll see increase in heat shock proteins in those individual cells. So even totally separate from the human body, they're able to upregulate. But as I mentioned before, they're really more than heat stress, right? So many other stresses can actually upregulate these things. If we, give you a big dose of some kind of virus, you'll actually see heat shock proteins go up because it's a stressor.
Oh, interesting.
So,
Yeah. So I guess
anything
that's, oh, okay.
yeah, so a lot of things that can get upregulated. And what's interesting is that, if you take someone who's totally sedentary, and let's face it, a lot of people like that, right? People don't like
Yeah.
to be hot. People really don't like to be cold. People don't like to exercise. So people like to just keep things as mellow and simple as possible. And I think that's not part of our human experience. Should be not being pushed through exercise, through heat stress, through going to altitude, through cold stress. So if we're thermostatic, then these heat shock proteins and other really important regulating hormones in our body decrease. And then the unfortunate thing is if you're being unhealthy, then you've got, or being psychologically stressed, and all the negative things that can come up that get chronically activated, like cortisol, right? Cortisol is a really important hormone. It's kind of our stress hormone. Really important if you're, running away from a lion and trying to do that, but not good if you're chronically stressed for weeks and weeks and weeks, and then that cortisol's up all the time. So
Yeah.
it's like anything else. If you use it the right way, you stress it, it's going to have a great adaptation, be really healthy. If you don't stress it at all, it's going to be downregulated. It's not going to be healthy. If you overcook it, do way too much, then you're going to downregulate things as well. So there's that happy window that it's no different from anything else. What your doctors tell you, what your psychiatrists tell you, what your any health practitioner tells you, what your acupuncturist tells you, right? None is not good.
Right.
Some to a lot is really good, but too much is too much.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad you brought this up because I actually had it written down. I wanted to ask you about this idea of being thermostatic, which I think to a lot of people, well, first they're probably like, what the hell does that mean? But am I correct? Thermostatic means that like this idea of, like this AC driven world where we're able to kind of maintain like one consistent temperature all the time. We're not getting too hot. We're not getting too cold. Is that thermostatic?
Absolutely. Yep. Going in the wintertime, you're going from your heated home to your heated car to your heated office. Well, in a normal year, I guess, right? Maybe not this year, but then the summer, you're going from your air conditioned house, your air conditioned car to your air conditioned gym, and then into your air conditioned work, right? Wherever you're going. So yeah, we're not letting our body get challenged. And I think that challenge is really, really central to human health and performance.
Yeah. Okay. And I guess that's exactly what I wanted. You said as much, right? It's like the body needs to be challenged and it's essential. Right. And I guess an example would be like these heat shock proteins, which are so critical to just like the way that we operate. So, understanding how critical heat is to your point, as like a mechanism to challenge the human body, right? And it's critical to health. One thing I wanted to ask you, and I actually saw it in one of your articles, or that you were mentioned in, that there's actually a facility in Manhattan where like people will train in the cold. And so one of the things that kind of like made me think, like, is there an optimal temperature that people should train within? Or I guess maybe a better way to put it is like, is there an optimal temperature for performance when we're talking about, strength, speed, athletic endeavors?
Great question, and really, really fascinating topic. So, one of my former doctoral students, Matt Ely, who's now working at Spalding Rehab Hospital as part of Harvard, he took a deep dive and look at this and looked at elite marathon performance and looked at all the different temperatures. And so, from that, at least for running a marathon, we know that probably the ideal temperature is right around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's actually pretty chilly, right? It's pretty chilly. And that's because as soon as you go over that temperature, then you're kind of getting into a place where you have to rely on some really heat loss mechanisms. If you start going too cold, then sometimes people, one of the responses to cold, your skin feels cold. And even before your body temperature drops, you get some muscle tension occurring. So if you're an elite runner and you get even a little bit of muscle tension, you have to fight against that a little bit. That's that small change in economy, we call it, efficiency, another way of looking at it.
Yeah.
Could be a difference between winning and losing. So what's happened is, and it speaks a little bit to the point I said earlier about making sure that we really separate our high intensity workouts. We want those in a cool environment. If you can't do the same intensity because it's too hot, you're not getting the neurological, the mechanical, the muscle adaptations that you would if you were doing it on a hot environment and doing less work, right? You're slower pace with slower speed. So we want people to maximize their performance in a cooler environment. And so that's what some of these places in Manhattan, other places, these cold gyms, as they're called, right? The idea is that you can do more work, and you even think about like a CrossFit workout, right? I did CrossFit for a little while, pretty horrible at it, but I enjoyed it. And still do a lot of the moves and stuff. But boy, I would go into the box, and then they have this, it's here in Eugene. So in the winter times, it's 36, 38 and wet outside, and you're cold in there, man, you're miserable. And then you start working out, and within 20 minutes, you're just sweating buckets, right? So like imagine the temperature of that room is 20 degrees, 30 degrees hotter, right? Then some of your performance might go down. So idea for some of these cold places is if you go and work out in a really, really cold environment, then you're actually going to do more work during that time. That's more work stress on your muscles. Therefore, your muscles are doing more load, then they're going to hopefully recover to that and become stronger. So we do the same thing in a lot hotter condition. Maybe you can't hit those peak values. So I love the idea of separating the heat and cold. So you're doing a lot of your really hard, intense, where you really want to maximize your performance on that given day. Make it nice and cool, right? Do it in a cool environment. But the problem then, of course, is if you're only working in a cold environment, when you go to a hotter environment, you're not going to be prepared for that. So we want to make sure that you have that balance between heat and cold. So when I do work with a lot of, just individual athletes who contact me and want some information and other things, and I kind of tell them this, it's great if people read like some of the stuff that you've seen on the heat side of things, like, well, I'm going to do all my workouts now in my closet. I'm going to have a heater in there. I'm like, whoa. If your goal is to heat acclimate, let's talk about how to do that the right way, and let's make sure you're not doing it so it disrupts all your workouts, right?
Yeah.
And as much as I love the heat, and I've done a lot of pretty challenging events myself in hot environments, I can tell you that if I don't prepare a lot in the cool to make sure I maximize my performance, you're slower. You're just not as fast by training in the hot all the time.
Oh, that makes sense. Well, all right. I promise now this will be the real last question.
Keep going. I don't mind. It's okay.
You hear a lot about like contrast, get in the sauna, jump in a cold shower, get in the sauna, jump in a cold tub. What is the benefit of that? I guess maybe that is the question, right? Like from like an athletic standpoint, like what is happening there on a physiological level where it's beneficial to go in a really short amount of time, from two very drastic environments. I guess what's happening.
Right. Yeah. So that's a really interesting question, a complex question, and one that with this contrast therapy, there's not enough information on there yet. So historically, in the sauna use in like Finland, they often the classic way of looking at it is they go in the sauna for a while, they run outside and run around the snow or jump into a frozen lake. Well, jump into a very cold lake and it's not frozen, I guess you'd say. Right, and then go back in again. I think part of that is anytime you get your body up to a certain temperature or you do anything kind of thing at a steady state, you start adapting to that. So if you throw in another stressor to it, now you drop temperature again, now you're going to raise it up again. Now you're going to be activating more of these pathways again that get upregulated to changes in stress. So I think that's part of it. The other part of it is if you're going to go in a perfect example of this, I've been taking a lot of hot baths to try and raise my body temperature up. And I can tolerate hot as I can tolerate for maybe 30 minutes or so, depending on how hot it is. But if I get out after 10, 15 minutes and then get in the shower, cold shower, rinse off, get back on the heat again, get back in the cold shower, get back in again, back and forth, the total amount of heat I can actually get in is better. Is better for me. I can do it for a longer period of time. And
Oh,
I think
really?
those high excursions, low excursions, and body temperature make a difference. I will
Huh.
say that one of the, again, you probably saw this as a football player, but we see it in other sports as well. Cold is an interesting one because a lot of really great work out of a number of investigators, but in particular, I'd say Jonathan Peake down in Australia. He has done some of the probably think the best work on this topic, and that is, as a football player or as a working with elite runners, oftentimes you'll see people do these real intense workouts, weightlifting or downhill running or something like that, and they get in a cold tub afterwards and cool their legs off. Feels great, right? Well, we now know that some of the inflammation you get from these really intense exercises are really important for the adaptation of that muscle.
Mm.
Cut down the inflammation by taking ibuprofen, anti-inflammatories, or you use a lot of cold stress, that you will feel better the next day. There's no performance benefit, but your legs will not be as sore, and you might be able to perform a little better the next day. But if you keep doing that after each successive training period, you're actually decreasing the adaptation by shutting down these pathways that are so
Mm.
important to adaptation. So it's really important that people don't walk away from something like this saying, okay, if I go and use cold stress, for example, every time I do my heavy workouts or my hard runs, I'm going to go and get in the cold. I'm going to get in a cold tank or sit in the cold bath.
Right. Which is exactly what last time I played was like 10, 11 years ago, but that's exactly what we did. Especially in
Absolutely.
like summer camp, you'd get done. The first thing you would do is you would try and avoid the lineman tub, but then wherever you netted out a free spot, you jumped in the cold tub.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, for the next day, you might feel a little better. And my daughter is a high level soccer player, and their coaches used to tell her the same thing. After during tournaments, they'd say, "Oh, go sit in the cold tub," and I'd be ice tub. I'm like, okay, well, she'll feel better the next day, but as a training practice, it's not a good idea. You're better off
Yeah. Okay.
using heat, or you can even use contrast if you want. But I really suggest people stay away from using cold to right immediately after exercise for during normal training. I think that's a mistake based on a number of people's work, but particularly Jonathan Peake from Australia.
Oh, wow. And how long should someone wait for kind of that positive, I'm going to call it a positive, like that inflammation process to take place? Like, is it a matter of hours? Is it a whole day? Like, how long should someone avoid kind of like cutting short that inflammation process?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, no one's really teased apart how long that period of time is. But I definitely say, within the next 3-4 hours, you want to try and avoid it.
Oh,
There's been
wow.
some, and I'm not sure how well researched this is at this point, but there's been some talk in the endurance world of saying, well, after you do a long workout, you should avoid blueberries, excuse me, for the next 3 or 4 hours as well,
Hmm.
because they're antioxidants, and we know that with exercise training creates an oxidative stress. Our
Hmm.
mindset is that oxidative stress, inflammation are unhealthy things. But we found now that no, they're a very important part of our adaptation in the local muscle and in the cardiovascular system to these stressors and to exercise. So the adaptation part, there are signaling molecules for that. The places where things go bad for inflammation and oxidative stress, it's when they're up constantly, right?
Hmm.
If you have constant oxidative stress or you have constant low grade inflammation, then you've got this unhealthy profile. So to your point, I really think we haven't seen anything that says that after you've done your exercise, heating the muscle up, I think it's great, right? That raises your body temperature up during exercise, keeps it up a little bit longer while you're recovering, and there's no one's seen any true downsides to that in as far as the skeletal muscle
Oh,
performance, other things. But the cold, it can shut, if the skeletal muscle is truly getting cold, right? If you just get in after you work out and do a cold shower real quick and just cool your skin off and feel a little better, that's not going to disrupt it. It really is getting
okay.
that muscle tissue cold. And that's what you get by sitting in a cold bath.
Oh, wow. It's fascinating. What's so interesting to me too is, with some of this stuff, like you said, it's still being researched and there's a lot of work to be done, which I think a lot of people will just be interested because, well, and also it kind of just reiterates like so much of what you hear you got to be careful whose advice you take, because a lot of it is not necessarily grounded in research yet.
Absolutely. Yep, for sure. And research is sometimes behind what athletes are doing too, right? There's a lot of things athletes do that we're just kind of trying to scratch the surface on and saying, well, how can we do that in a study? How can we get money? Unfortunately, research is expensive. So we have to get people to fund our projects, and that's always a challenge.
Yeah. Well, actually, that's a good point. And we can end on this. For people who would like to follow some of the work that you're doing, or, if you're up for it, if people would like to get in touch with you, where should we point them?
Yeah, so if people want to get in touch with me, I'm easy to find. You can just go to the University of Oregon website, and you'll see Department of Human Physiology, or just put my last name in the search button, you'll find me. So I'm under faculty at the Department of Human Physiology at University of Oregon. And I do try and help people out when I can. I can't answer all emails all the time. Depends on how fast and furious they come. I can tell you before, when 3 days before Boston becomes the Boston Marathon happens, and it's going to be harder than predicted. All of a sudden, people start getting a hold of me like, what can I do? It's like, contacted me a few weeks ago, we could have chatted, but now not so easy. But yeah, absolutely. So and certainly, I'm not the best at maintaining a good Twitter site and that kind of stuff, but I have some things I kind of forward or put in there when it's relevant. And we try and put some stuff on our website as well.
Oh, perfect. Well, you're actually busy doing the work. versus just talking about it. And managing a social media profile. Well, I'll tell you what, this has been one of my favorite episodes. I have no doubt that this is going to be incredibly insightful for people. And I'm so glad that we had this conversation. If you'd be up for it, I would definitely want to have you back on in the future, because I feel like we're just scratching the surface probably on the work that you and your team are doing out of the University of Oregon.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. I've loved this experience, and as you can hopefully tell, I'm really passionate about this from personal and professional fronts. And it's just there's so much cool stuff, as you said, that we can do and talk about. And I'd be honored and happy to come back anytime for sure. And maybe interesting to see what questions your listeners come up with, and we can always focus on something on that at a later date.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things that I'll request is that people send those along. And I'll probably include a couple from my daughter, because like I said, she was so fired up about this. She actually asked me, and it melted my heart. She was like, can I be the first one to listen to it? And she's 6. So
that's awesome. That's awesome.
Of course you can.
That's awesome. Fantastic.
Well, thank you so much. And it's been a pleasure having you on.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ken.